The following is from a recording made on February 17th, 2004. Foundation Matter the Body Itself, a seminar given by David G. Leahy, New York Philosophy Corporation.
Unity, literally in Latin, would be the combination of unum and etas, which is a suffix which has to do with the quality or the state of. So unity in English is unitas in Latin, which is the state of being one, being parenthesis. Understood, right? The state of one, the state oneness, we might say in a more Germanic English, oneness. Okay, so I'm saying something like that, but a little more. I want to say something a little more active than oneness. In other words, what I'm replacing, I'm going back to the Latin and replacing what would be the etos, the notion of a quality or a state of something. I'm replacing that etos with the esse, because I want to associate the unity with, now I'm speaking a little more loosely in English, right? I want to associate the notion of the one with the active notion of being, which is in the ipsum esse of Thomas's, which is in Thomas's ipsum esse, right? Where the esse is an active verbal thing, not simply a connotation of a status, of a state. Does that help any? Okay. I noticed, by the way, that in today's reading, I think somewhere, I hope we'll come across it, I use the term, oh no, I don't do it in Latin, that's why I didn't notice it. That's why I noticed it.
You do use it in Latin.
Oh, do I use it in Latin?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ipsum esse, or unum esse.
Unum esse.
Yeah, but what I don't use in Latin in today's assignment, but which is relevant to the question, is I speak in English of it itself. I say, this is it, it itself. Okay. Now, I don't know, I can't tell you what I had in mind, whatever, 20, 30 years ago, whenever I did that. I don't remember when I did it even. But when I was rereading it for class, it occurred to me that when I say it itself, if I translate back into the Latin, I'm back to Augustine, because it's Augustine who speaks of, where Thomas speaks of ipsum esse as God. Augustine, some 800 years previously, speaks of id ipsum, which is very foreign to us because of Thomas and everything else has gone in the meantime. You see, all that subjectivity that begins to surface in Thomas's theology and becomes full-blown in modern self-consciousness. Well, Augustine really doesn't know anything about that. And so when he identifies the Godhead, he's got the notion that it's a ipsum something, it's in itself something, but it's not it's even more objectively an it, right? In other words, he's much more wary. He wants to identify it in the what shall I say, in the sparsest possible terms, right? But whatever the Godhead is, whatever it is, in the case of God, it is itself. So there's no distinction between predicate and subject, as we've said in different contexts. Okay, well, maybe that'll come up again. Let me start, as I like to do, with questions. Any other questions specific to the assignment?
Are we going to read through?
Hope we're going to try.
Good, then I'll just interrupt with questions.
Okay.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
I apologize for not being here last week, but trying to catch up.
Okay.
And speaking of Augustine, on pages 630
In the appendix, right?
Yeah, 630
Right.
and following, where you try to lay on the new mathematics.
Well, let's call it logic. I prefer logic. It has a mathematical dimension, as we were saying last week, but let's start with it's being a logical digit.
Okay, so
Logical calculus.
At the top of page 631, having applied 1 to the Father,
Right.
and not nothing to the Son,
Right.
and unum to the Spirit,
Yeah, not nothing. Mm-hmm.
right? When you apply that 1 to the only God,
Mm-hmm.
is that a pun of some sort, or are you Are you
Do I
using the one in two different
yeah,
ways?
it's the latter. It's the latter, I think. There may be
Why
some
do you
pun.
do that?
Well, because if you go look at the equation that heads that paragraph at the bottom of 630, the logical equations, which I put there at the head of each of these selections from Augustine.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that in this paragraph you'll find basically this particular set.
Yes.
Okay. And in that set and elsewhere in this appendix, you will notice, and in the logical chapter, you will notice that 1 equals 0 unum 1. And I was saying last time, there is this, I don't know whether, I'm not sure ambiguity is the right term, but there is this moment where you have to hesitate and say, well, wait a minute now. The Father is God, and we know that from the get-go. I mean, we know that from Genesis, okay? And retrospectively, it's clear to Christianity, right? But only to Christians, it's clear, looking back at the Old Testament, that the Trinity is there at least to be discovered, do you say? But Jewish piety does not see a Trinity in the Christian sense. You see what I'm saying? Okay, so we know from the get-go that God and the Father are God, right? Or God the Father is God. You see? So so it's not just the logical digits. If I took the digits off if I unsuperimpose them, what Augustine is saying is that not only is the Father God, which in the Judeo-Christian tradition is a given, but so equally is the Son God. So in other words, not only is one, right? So we got two ones, as it were, one qua person and one qua divine essence. So the one qua person, one the Father, is one, the divine essence. 0, the Son, right, is one, the divine essence, and unum is one. That's the idea. So you can write the equation that the one, meaning the divine essence, is Father, Son, and Spirit. And Augustine, maybe not in these particular selections, but elsewhere in the De Trinitate, says exactly that without the logical digits. He says the divine essence, translate here, one, is the three persons.
But logically or mathematically,
Right.
I'm sorry.
Okay, well, any way you want.
I'll get away from.
You can call it mathematics, but it isn't. Okay.
I
Okay.
don't want to get the ruler applied to my knuckles, but I'm just saying.
Yeah, you know, I'm always very patient with you, Jim.
Well, I know you pride yourself on your humility. Too.
That's right.
But seriously,
Yeah.
To the extent that this is a mathematics.
It is a mathematics in the broader sense of the word.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, when you
a calculus.
I mean, I was particularly struck by the superimposition of these numbers on this text.
Okay.
Because to me, it gives a quality of the Father to the other two that the other two don't have.
That's correct.
Somehow.
Yeah, but this is good theology, and this is exactly Augustine's point. The Son and the Spirit come from the Father. The Father does not come from them. So that's a difference.
Yeah.
Now, they come in different ways. The Son is generated, that's why he's the Son, and the Spirit proceeds from the Father. So,
Well, by the way, the word is born here on page 633. It's not generated.
Well, it's the translation. Okay. Well, 633 where? Where is it?
633 in the middle, it says that
of whom he was
the
born,
son
right?
of
That's
whom
right.
he was born.
Yeah, that's.
You don't like that?
No, I don't like that. I mean, he wasn't born in the sense of like
bearing
Athena from Zeus's head.
Uh-huh.
Born.
So what's the difference? What's the
He was generated.
What's the difference logically
Right.
between born and proceeds? I mean, does it call for a different kind of
Yes, the difference
transition
logically is
other
the
than an
difference.
equal sign?
The difference logically between that which proceeds from the Father and that which is generated by the Father. The logical difference is what proceeds from the Father is unum. What is generated by the Father is 0. That's why unum and 0 are differently set up. That's why there's a line over one.
I understand But I'm just saying the order in which these logical, whatever they are, expressions flow. I think you go somewhere else in the book. Actually, in the next reading, you go to great trouble in reordering the relation between A and B. You know, segments of the line.
Right.
Right. And then you go D to B. Right. You don't
Okay.
go right. You see what I'm saying? So is there any significance to the order in
Yes. But now this was
which this was covered last time?
no, this was covered the last time you were absent. So I'll give you the handouts
That you
that
didn't get.
cover this. Yeah, that
Right.
you didn't receive.
Okay.
And this one is a rather exhaustive illustration of how it is that the unum, theologically speaking, the spirit in the Augustinian text, is the middle, the union, as it were, the place of the union of Father and Son, of one and zero in logical terms, and that it is so in a, as it were, I don't like the Hegelian language, but it'll have to do for now, in a thoroughgoingly determinate way. And I can explain that to you. I don't want to take time.
No.
Yeah, okay.
I
So that there is
apologize
a.
to everybody else, but,
No, that's all right. There is an order, and it's. Intrinsic to the logic that there is such an order.
and it is that historical, that order?
Well, what I'm doing in the appendix that you've pointed to is I'm saying, look, isn't this interesting? The logic is the logic, right? So the logic, I point out at the beginning of that appendix, the logic I developed in '85, and I point out that I developed it for what I would call purely conceptual reasons, as it were, for logical reasons. In other words, in order to have a logic that distilled the fundamental thought called the thinking now occurring, in which there is no nothing. Okay, so I did that for that reason, and I was not thinking about the Trinity, and I certainly wasn't thinking about Augustine's text, right, in 1985. So the reason the appendix is there is to point out what I discovered, somewhat to my amazement, positive amazement, was when I looked at the text of the Trinity in 1992, right, and I was reading along, I began to notice that, wow, and I began to fill in what I've now finalized here with a pencil. I filled in the 0 and 1 and see if it worked, because it seemed to me that it should work, and it did work. So I've abstracted that principle here. So if you ask me historically, was that the last question?
Yeah.
Is the order there historically? Yes. In other words, the love of the Father for the Son, which is reciprocated perfectly, that love is a third person. Which it would not be, theologically speaking, if God were not, now I'm going to use a kind of Thomistic way of putting it, if God were not absolutely infinite or omnipotent, if there were any limitation in God, then when God thought himself and loved the thought of himself that he had, as it were, right? If he were not perfectly infinite in the sense in which Descartes speaks of the idea of God as a positive infinity, right? Not a negation of the finite. If he were not perfectly infinite, then the love between him and his perfect image, let's assume he could perfectly image himself in the Word, right? Or think himself in the Word, understand himself in the Word, even if you allow that understanding would be so perfect that it would be another person equal to the Father, to go all the way, then the love between them, since the power of the Father to generate his likeness is absolutely unlimited, right? The love that exists between the Father and his generated image, the second person, the Word, that love is itself a person. That's the theological notion, basically. I don't know. Okay, and therefore, again, it's spatial images are not great, but therefore the Spirit is in the middle in such a way, you see, that there's an identity of the Father and the Son and the Spirit where I can't distinguish any one or the other of them as more or less divine than the other, which is Augustine's recurrent thesis in these selections. Okay? Tentatively. All right. Any other questions?
We just
Yeah.
keep mulling over this.
Okay.
I mean, it seems to me not to really say that this isn't less marvelous, but in a certain sense, the criteria for the ternary logic is already identical to the criteria for the Trinity. But isn't that surprising that they would be? You would find that they are superimposed. That is to say that there is this separation of relation, but not separation by inequality.
Okay.
So those are the principles are the same. So it isn't that surprising
Okay.
that they would in fact be
Well,
isomorphic.
all right, I'll agree with you, Charlie. I wasn't that surprised.
Yeah, okay.
But I was surprised.
Yeah. You hadn't generated for that.
That's right.
For that purpose,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, but you're right. I wasn't that surprised. Right. There should be.
Yeah.
At the deepest level, there should be that.
It would be pretty surprising
If it
weren't.
wasn't. Yes. That's a good point.
Yeah, but I tell you that this one, the ambiguity with which you use one, I think throws that off. I think there's either a requirement for another digit or for some notation on the one when you're talking about it as the nature which the three persons share. Because that's certainly speculatively, you can easily do that. It doesn't disturb the theology of Augustine to say, well, three persons.
Well, it
one
would,
God.
because if you...
Three persons and one God. But when we're talking about the one nature in which the three persons inhere or partake, then we're going to call that God. We're going to call it the Godhead, whatever we're going to call it. We're not going to lay on the same one that we use
For the Father.
For the Father.
But that's not good theology. Because
Well,
then,
I'm not saying it's. I'm not talking about the theology of it. I'm talking about.
well, then it's
the
not good
math of
logic
it.
either. But I mean,
You mean you can't say this? Is that what you're saying? It's inevitable?
well, I'm saying then you would be. I think you almost said it if you didn't explicitly say it.
Mhm.
We'll have to go back and check. You almost said if you didn't you implied if you didn't make explicit that there should be a fourth. Right? In other words, you would turn the identification of the three with that one. You would say, no, well, wait a minute, that one is something different than any one of those three, including the other one in that three, or the sum of them. And the whole point is that one is no different, as Augustine points out, and isn't true in the logic, is no different than any of the three digits, or no different from the collection of the three digits.
So you're perfectly comfortable with using the same number
Right.
for the collectivity, if you will.
So I would rather say digit, but okay, same number,
digit.
same logical number,
Well, it
logical
just
digit.
doesn't- I don't know.
Well, it's not.
Maybe just
It can function as a number, but not originally in the logic, not primarily in the logic.
Yeah.
All right. One more time. Any other questions? More questions? Okay, so let's do something unprecedented and just go right to the text here and see if we can start at the beginning of today's assignment, which assignment will also take us back to some of these other logical things that we've given short shrift to in trying to get through the logical sections. On page 350, now for the first time, the atonement is existence. The new atonement is existence. The consciousness of the new atonement thinks essentially what? It thinks essentially, unfortunate unconditionally was the fall, unhappy absolutely was the sin, completely sorrowful was the death. And I should pause that right there because I think this is characteristic of the thinking now occurring, and I think it is I'm very averse to using the word that I'm tempted to use because of my association with Altizer radical, right? It's not literally radical because that's rooted, but it's really a new thing to say, so it's extreme. In fact, I'll take something I said last time, last section, not last time, last course, when I was noticing the meaning of outrageous, right, as a kind of beyond the limit, right? This goes beyond a traditional limit. The traditional limit, if at the risk of raising too many theological issues here, if you go back theologically, there is in the I don't know whether in the theology, it's an interesting question, but certainly in the what's the word I'm looking for? In the ritual, in the thank you. In the liturgy of the church, there is the notion of the felix culpa, the happy fall, right? In other words, the notion is, well, yeah, it was a bad idea for Adam and Eve to disobey God, and they were punished and thrown out of paradise and so forth. Hey, as it turns out, that's wasn't so bad after all, because they might have just stayed in paradise forever, watering the flowers and feeding the deer in the park and so forth. And as a result of the fall, God decided eventually to save mankind, not just restore us to some primordial paradise, you see, but rather to transform the world, give us a new heaven and earth, a resurrected body, and so forth and so on. And so in the liturgy of the church is the notion that culpa, the fault, the sin of Adam and Eve, you see, in some respect was a fortunate thing, a happy thing, a felix culpa, right? And that's being denied in the thinking now occurring. And so if you say, well, wait a minute, why would you want to deny that notion? Well, first of all, let me start with somebody like Hegel. The extreme interpretation, if I could put it that way, or the extreme, or take the pious happy fault of the church, and then secularize it or naturalize it in the context of modern self-consciousness, then that turns into the Hegelian notion, which is also the Erich Frommian notion, which is also the kind of normal contemporary interpretation of the fall, which I think we discussed in a different context, that, well, only through disobedience could Adam and Eve, come into maturity, right? In other words, in order to become independent persons, they had to disobey mom and dad, or in this case, dad, so that it has a kind of growth function, right, in the secular naturalistic interpretation. The extreme of which, therefore, turns out to be Altizer's atheistic theology, you see, in which the creation of the world, it's not just, see, compared to Altizer, Hegel is rather guarded. Hegel is rather circumspect, because what it turns out to be is that God himself falls, God himself sins, God himself has an evil will, and that evil will, that fall of the Godhead, right, you see, from its primordial state, right, is in Altizer, it is the creation of the world, you see, so that if you think of the notion of the creation of the world as some sort of positive thing, then the ultimate rationalization of felix culpa, the ultimate in extremis reading of that is Altizer's notion that God wills evil, or as I said the last term we were doing this, that in Altizer what we have is the ultimate self-justification of evil, right? Or there's no better justification of evil than that the divine creative will cannot be truly creative of the world unless it wills evil in this positive, and not just positive, but in this absolutely unqualified sense. That's where Altizer is at. Okay, so this is...
I have a question just about that point.
Yeah.
How's that different from the standard Gnostic idea?
Oh, Altizer. That's not easy to do, but
well, yeah,
it's,
I mean,
He does it by redefining Gnosticism as meaning something other than Gnosticism.
I can try and do it. I don't worry too much. Well, first I'll give you a shorthand, but it's not going to help
Yeah.
much. The shorthand is that the death of God, as I've just described it in this context, is the inversion and the reversal of Gnosticism. So, in classic Gnosticism, the God who creates the world is simply an evil God.
yeah, I realized that as I asked the question.
Okay.
Go ahead with the
You see?
answer. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
in other words, now what we have is that what in a straightforward Gnosticism would be an evil God creating an evil world, that turns out to be a blessing. You see? In fact, you're helping me to show you the connection here with the Felix Culpa idea, right? In other words, it's the creation of this evil world, which is Felix, which is a wonderful, happy. It's grace. So in Altizer, he has no qualms about saying this in his books in the 90s. I mean, it's all there, but it's explicit in the 90s. That salvation is damnation, right? The salvation of the world is God's self-damnation, right? And you don't go to hell unless you deserve it, right? So God condemns himself to hell and undergoes the damnation, which is synonymous with the creation.
There's no higher Godhead in Altizer, which is good.
Well,
It's the
beyond-
higher Godhead.
It's the God himself has this duality that's
Yeah.
being expunged.
Yeah.
No?
No.
it's more Hegelian than that. It's more dialectical. In other words, there is a primordial God who kills himself. I mean, to put it crudely.
No, but the primordial God has this duality, this good and evil in it that also falls.
I think that's
There is
Hegel. I don't think that's Altizer. There is a primordial God who's... Now I'm going to have to do a little... I said I'm against interpretation, so I'm just showing you no philosopher is perfectly consistent. A little interpretation of Altizer, right? There's a primordial God who is blissfully happy. This is...
And that's evil.
Well,
Yeah.
wait
That
a minute.
is, yeah.
That's evil from whose point of view? From the
your
world,
point, yeah.
from our point of view, right?
Yeah.
This God who is up there judging the world. Who the hell is God to judge? What you're saying? It's offensive to the natural self-consciousness that there should be this God who stands apart from the world, and in whose very being apart from the world is a judgment upon the world. Right? So that God, right? So there is this God who is a kind of an embodiment of a kind of Epicurean blissfulness. By the way, I think this is all a boogeyman, by the way, historically, okay? But this is modern self-conscious, this appropriation of the notion of God through, I don't mean to blame it on Descartes, it's not all his fault, but in other words, when God gets reduced to being an idea in Descartes, that's the setup for the notion of God, or God as the notion of God, and makes it possible, therefore, to conceive of a God who's remote from the world in some primordial and original sense, but who, in a rationalized Christianity, then is understood at some point, as it were, in the recognition of this, condemns himself. It condemns himself to be for being the judge of the world. To say
That's similar to the issue in the Kabbalah, really, where the roots of judgment have to be expunged, and judgment has the double sense of logical judgment and moral judgment, and so this creation itself is this contraction of God to get rid of that judgmental.
Yeah. And I think, and I point out I think we'll get to some more elaborate footnotes in which I bring in a lot of stuff on the Kabbalah through Sholem and through, and in relation to Derrida, which is, I think, not an accident. And yes, and also point out in that footnote, which we'll come to, not today, but later on, that yes, I think there is there is an important connection between the Kabbalistic thinking, if we can put it that way, the Kabbalistic understanding, and modernity. They're not simply the same, but they do share something in common. Yeah, so that you should see that in Altizer or something analogous in Altizer is not surprising. Yeah.
Well, I think there's
Okay.
a clear history that
Okay.
goes from Lurianic Kabbalah through Jacobana, through Schelling, through
Yeah.
to Altai.
Right. Okay. All right. No. Wait. Okay. So now, all right. So having kind of I'm trying to provide a context for this statement and to point out that it is. I don't know if radical is not the right word literally. It is uncompromising. This is This is a statement which is saying that there is nothing good about the fall. Okay. And if I put it in philosophical terms, now I've just given you a kind of theologically oriented explanation of why I might want to do that, although I've already tied it in with the philosophy. But just backing up a little bit and speaking a little more abstractly, I really, in effect, said it along the way, but I just want to heighten it. In other words, the notion of Felix culpa, or the notion that the fall might not be unconditionally unfortunate, okay, is a function of self-consciousness. Okay, in other words, it's so that in that so in a thinking that in essence leaves self behind, you see, then as it were there is no support for the notion. Right? Or I might almost say there's no support because the support of self-consciousness for the notion of a fortunate fall is the need that self-consciousness has, you see, as it were to alleviate its own sense of lostness or whatever. So and by the way, it's very human. No one's denying that Hegel is very human. Okay. It may be very human, but it isn't very divine. I guess is what the thinking now occurring is saying. It may be very understandable, but it is nevertheless not compatible with the thinking now occurring. So,
you're basically concerned to deny all of the models of creative evolution, as it were. That there is a process, a dialectical process,
mm-hmm. Right.
by which a lesser state evolves into a higher state, and so that the redeemed condition is somehow a product of
right.
Natural growth, as it were,
right.
that has a dialectical structure.
Yes, that's correct. And even more abstractly, the thinking now occurring rejects the notion of process. Right?
Yeah.
And that relates to the emphasis placed on the radical discontinuity of the continuum. Right. So yes, in that sense. So I suppose evolution by leaps, right? Evolution by discontinuity. Not that there's no. So at that point, you see, it's more like what I would understand by history, right? That history is a kind of movement, but it's a movement that is not grounded in continuity. Yeah. Right. Okay.
Well, I mean that's really important. I think that's a kind of essential difference between what you're doing in anybody.
Okay.
It's what is not similar between the thinking now occurring and say Teilhard.
Right. Yes.
It's not any of those pictures of a kind of progression towards an ideal
That's
condition,
right.
which itself is conditioned by process. So it's anti-modern in both its opposition to true Darwinian nihilism or pseudo-Darwinian creative evolution.
Okay.
In other words, you have these two versions
right.
of evolutionary theory that emerge
right.
in the 19th century. One which is fundamentally the survival of the fittest means the survival of what survives. And you have this other model which is theosophical or anthroposophical or Spencerian or all of these different, or even in a sense Marxian, all these different pictures of evolution using that same word, but in which it's not just simply random selection, natural selection over random variation, but there is some kind of teleological movement
right.
that's embedded in a kind of process.
Right.
So
and in terms of what we keep making reference to as central to this understanding of the history of thought is pragmatism, Peirce, is an evolutionary
Yeah.
logic and an evolutionary cosmos, modified by the very pragmatic notion of the general tendency.
Yeah.
Right. So he makes allowance for dead ends,
Yeah.
but nevertheless adheres to the notion of a general tendency in the if you could go to the end point, then you would realize the ultimately real, and in that sense, the ultimate realization of the idea. Right. Now, the thing that saves pragmatism from that in Peirce is that we never actually arrive at that point. This is relevant to something that Bill asked me before class. We were just sitting around waiting for everybody to knock on the door. He made the comment, I don't know if it was a question or a comment, but to the effect that the thinking now occurring scene was very optimistic. And I've heard this before, and my reaction, and I may have to find a better word, but not optimistic, but hopeful, right? In the sense that thinking now occurring represents an unprecedented opportunity, you see, but not in the context of it's not the latest stage in some inevitable process, more or less inevitable, right? But rather it's an unprecedented opportunity, and it remains to be seen in some sense how we will actually use it. Do you say? Right. Yeah.
This is I don't quite understand that, because
Okay.
I don't understand opportunity outside of process. We
Yeah. I'm not going to. You don't find it in the text.
Well, okay.
I'm cheating. Okay. Yeah. I mean,
You're responding to this optimism. And
that's
yet-
right. I'm trying to distinguish from the optimism.
Yeah,
Right?
but the text does declare Jubilee, which if not only is optimism, is better than optimism. It's
Okay.
we're already there.
That's right.
Yeah.
But in some sense, what we're dealing with here is in the language characteristic of the thinking now occurring, there is the end of the world in essence, right? It's the end of the world essentially, and the end of the world essentially is the advent of the New Jerusalem, right? But it is also the advent of the judgment. To say it has an eternally positive and an eternally negative implication, but all of that now has been brought into the absolute now, right? And that's so. Yeah, I mean, in a sense, you're right, and that's what, even myself, I think that the word hope it's better than optimism, but I'm not sure that's right either, strictly speaking.
But I mean, why isn't it simultaneously terror?
Yes. Yeah. Right. Well, okay. Yeah.
I mean,
well,
if the judgment is still pending.
well, I guess what? Yeah. Okay, it's good. So the real question here is not to. So if I step back and try and meditate on the wonderful or horrific, or terrible or terrifying aspects of what is being said here, then I'm really missing the point, because the only thing that works here is action, right? The only thing that works here is a creative activity, and in that sense, there's really, strictly speaking, there's no time for any form of self-reflection.
Yeah.
I think it's something
So
like that.
the old form of judgment,
Right.
which is in medieval terms, is an anticipation of
Right.
self-consciousness,
Right.
and through the development of those theologies that
Right.
try to maintain the medieval form through modernity,
Mhm.
it's simply the amalgam of self-consciousness on that which anticipates it. So that damnation and salvation both involve a subject that's being damned or
Right.
redeemed. The whole point is to move everything into a different space in which the activity is already redeemed, but is not redeemed in the sense of a judgment performed upon a subject. So what is the
Right.
judgment? What is the judgment? This was my question, at the end of the last
Mhm.
course. What is the judgment if there is no subject to be judged? Since the entire
Mhm.
tradition is a tradition in which a judgment is passed on a subject.
Mm-hmm. Before I try and answer that question, I want to back up just a half a step to something which you said, but remind me of something I was thinking about preparing this class, which may come up somewhere later on in the text. indirectly, but I might as well bring it up now because the reason I was going to bring it up initially is that it seems to be so fundamental and simple, and it has to do with this question of the subject. And it does come up in the text. The question of the future and the past comes up in today's assignment, right? I thought a way of encapsulating it, or a way of succinctly stating the situation, is that maybe I can quickly. I think I can actually find, because I made some notes here on page 356. Yeah, because it has to do with my my counter to Heidegger. Count is a little too simple, but my critique of Heidegger here, and the bottom line statement, which I then repeat a few times, at least once on page 356, in the bottom paragraph, about 7 or 8 lines down, that the subject is nothing. All right, and up in the top paragraph, about again 6 lines up from the bottom of the top paragraph on 356, just getting into the middle of that sentence there, about 6 or 7 lines up near the end of the line, that there is no subject not purely formal of the objectivity existing now in time for the first time, that the being of the subject is not extantness, but not other than extantness, that the being of the subject is itself the extent abyss, the abyss extent in the face of creation, apart from which abysmal after identity, it itself is absolutely impossible. Now, parsing that out, trying to parse that out a little bit in the context of what we're just talking about and what I want to bring out here, and it relates to something that keeps coming up about the relationship of the thinking now occurring to previous thought. In fact, it came up last time when the question of the past came up, and I was saying that the thinking now occurring is not so much, I was responding to something you said, Chuck, the thinking now occurring is not so much empowered by the past, although it does, in some sense, understand that there is a past, a real past, that exists prior to this moment in history. All right? But nevertheless, I was saying last time, the thinking now occurring in a certain sense is the empowerment of the past. Not that the past empowers the thinking now occurring, but the thinking now occurring empowers the past. And the way I was explaining that was that in the thinking now occurring, and this is, I think, irrelevant to what we're doing here, the thinking now occurring is the realization of what you might say is the essentially anticipatory nature of all past thinking. To say, and so where I'm going here, what I'm trying to get to, is the subject is nothing in the sense that the subject is now nothing. The subject belongs to the past. Do you say? It's not that it's denied that there ever. See, now this is the point of contact with Altizer. There is a point of contact here, and the inability to unravel the judgment, to find the traditional judgment in the absolute now, as distinguished from the jubilee that we're encountering in the absolute now. The difficulty, I'm not saying it's completely impossible to sort this out, but that initial difficulty that you're pointing to, that's a point of contact with Altizer's theology, in which the creation of the world is the divine willing evil. The most obvious difference from the death of God theology, between the death of God theology and the thinking now occurring, is that in Altizer this is God's doing. Do you see? What the thinking now occurring is saying is that this is not God's doing in the sense in which Altizer, that is, God as a subject, you see, creating and damning himself and so forth and so on. This is God's doing as the omnipotent creator, yes, who has created a world which, again, for want of perfect language here, but just to get the idea out quickly, with all the qualification of the word independence here, but creating a world that stands on its own, that is really and completely, as it were, independent of. In other words, the divine creation is so successful. It's like the Trinitarian idea. God understands himself, and he does so with an infinite perfection, which means what? That his understanding of himself is another person. Right? But it's such a perfect understanding of himself that this other person is, that they're both indistinguishably that one on the left-hand side of the equation, to say. Analogously, so Augustine, I think Augustine should be impressed by this idea. I have to get him back here.
Come on.
to ask him what he thinks. It's the analogous idea. In other words, it's not just that the Trinitarian persons are understood in terms of this infinitely unqualified perfection of the divine being, you see, but not just within. There's a term for this. I'm trying to think of it. I think it's the immanent Trinity. I think is the kind of jargon of the theologians, right? The Trinity considered within itself, right? What's being said here in a thinking in which there is no immanent and extrinsic Trinity. There's no Trinity, right? There's no inside and outside. Therefore, let's be consistent, right? If we're going to talk about the Trinity, then there's not going to be a Trinity is one thing within itself and something else only in a kind of degenerated sense outside of itself, you see. Right? A God whose simplicity is absolutely unqualified in the act of creation, you see, is able to achieve the perfect distinctness of the creation from God that is substantially analogous to the perfect distinction of the three persons within the one Godhead. You see? It's really the notion, and by the way, you know, so in other words, this is really
the distinctness then of the distinctness of the persons of the Trinity, the mutual distinctness, is analogous to the distinctness of the Godhead itself from its creation. Is that what you're saying? That the difference and the same.
Well,
that the distinctness and yet in its what?
It's not just the distinctness. It's that. Let's do it one step at a time. Let's do Father and Son. That's the easiest way. Okay. That the Father. The theology understands that the Word, the divine Word, in Trinitarian terms, is the one God, just as the Father, whose Word it is the one God. They're both the one God, as awkward as that may be.
And is that
right.
Is that because of the grammatical characteristic of language, which has the problem of distinguishing signifier from signified, say, to use modern jargon? That is to say, if I say hat, I have a hell of a time distinguishing the hats which I have used the term to indicate and the meaning of the word hat, which in other words, I'm not talking about the sounds hat. I'm talking about the signified of the hat. And is that signified different from the class of all hats which ever existed? Or ever will? That's a knowable problematic of nouns.
Perhaps.
And hats too, because we know that hats actually are nouns.
That's right.
When you put on a hat, and you're a different guy.
Yeah, but I would say the answer to your question, short answer is no, it isn't a matter of.
Okay. So distinguish then that problematic from the whole business of the word and the.
Let's do this. If God were a hat, right?
In Jewish things, of course,
could be a hat.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. If God were a hat, and God had a thought of hat, that is, of the hat that he was. Right? His thought of the hat that he was would be at once another hat, right? Which other hat was the same hat, right? That's where the Trinitarian problem comes from. If he had a thought of the hat that he was, it would be because he has a perfect thought. It's not an abstract hat. It's not the meaning of hat. Right? He has the perfect conception of himself,
where the signified and the reference are one.
Are one, yeah. Right? And yet, he has a thought of himself. Right? Right. Okay. That's where the problem starts and ends for Augustine. Right? And so yes, in our ordinary way of parsing our language and distinguishing the word from the thing, we have to, at a certain point we're gonna want to say this is a mystery. The thinking now occurring is a little bolder and it's saying, well, wait a minute, maybe we're wrong to think, or at least now at this point in history, it may be that we can now understand that it's not that the problem is at our end. That is to say, what is the real difference between the word and the thing? I mean, where did such an assumption ever come from? Where did the assumption
It,
You see what I'm saying?
Well, you can say it comes from the assumption that it comes from linguistics, which needs to be a science and therefore needs to speak of the extentness, as it were, of language, as if there were language apart from minds and thinkers and speakers, which is the situation of so-called scientific linguistics. You think you've got an object there that you can deal with.
Right.
So you think it's obvious that green isn't green. But it's damn well not so obvious to me.
When you think there's an object there,
Yeah.
in the sense in which I'm hearing you, explicitly or implicitly, you're thinking there's a subject here.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you get rid of that, when I say go back to page 356, that the subject is nothing, meaning in the fuller context that the subject, not that the subject, that's a little circle here, not that the subject never existed, because otherwise we have nothing to talk about, right? And then, see, in other words, the subject, that's the problem. The subject did exist, and in that sense, like Oldtimer, see, the subject is gone, but it's not, right? You see, it's not the God killing himself. You see, it's the transformation of thought at this point in history in which the world more perfectly, more so than ever before, can be understood to reflect the Trinitarian creator, the Trinity that creates the world. What I was about to say before we got into this one is that the notion that the world is created by the Trinity is classical theology. In other words, in one sense, the Father creates the world, but he does so, as Thomas will tell you, or as the Gospel of John will tell you, he does so in and through the Word, right? And as I think I may have mentioned this last time in a different context, and the principle of that creation is the Spirit, all right? So in other words, while each of them has a role, as it were, the as it were is very important there, in the creation of the world qua person, since they are the one God, it's not as if one person creates the world. If God creates the world, then all three persons have, as it were, a role in that in the creation of the world. All right, so what I'm saying in the thinking now occurring, in effect, is that the new state of the world, now intelligible, or the state of the world now new, precisely insofar as it is now intelligible in a way perfectly unprecedented, is that it can be understood to be, as it were now, in its very coming into being out of nothing, as such, to use the traditional language, the image of the Creator.
Well, the problem of evil
Right.
in all this
Right.
has bothered people. That may not bother you, but it has bothered people for centuries, right? So
Right.
so the distinctions between the Creator, whomever that or whatever that might be, and the creation was that no, God didn't create evil. He created freedom,
Right.
especially freedom of will, and that in turn has to be real, allow for the choice of evil. Now, so to the extent now that the new thinking identifies the Creator and the creation, how does evil fit in there?
Well, the premise is what I would first look at. To the extent to which the Creator and the creation are identified, right? The extent to which they are identified is the extent to which the creation is now intelligibly in the form of the Creator, right? See, in other words, it's not. They're not identified in any kind of pantheistic sense, right? They're not identified in the sense in which Hegel identifies the Word of God with nature, right? But the identification. Oh, but it's a good question because it takes me back to my Trinitarian analogy, which is no insubstantial analogy, to the extent to which the Father and the Son and the Trinity are identified, all right, it's not just that they are the one God, right, which would collapse them back again, but that as persons they are distinct. And what I was saying in the context of the inner life of the Trinity, as it would be traditionally understood, is that it is, in my way of explaining that, it's the infinite power of the Father or the Godhead in the person of the Father to think himself, this is bad language, right? But in our terms, think himself or know himself would be a little better. So that, as it were, he reproduces himself perfectly as a person. That is another person. Qua person, they are, right, real. One is not just a thought of myself. That thought is a person. Analogously, when you call the identification of the creature and the creator, I want to go slow there. I think there's an important truth there, and the identification is qua. Okay, good. Qua freedom, qua person. Now I got Kant and Thomas on my side. You see, because when you push comes to shove, Thomas says. And you see this reflected in Descartes' emphasis on the freedom of the will in the Meditations. Thomas says that man is most especially in the image of God in terms of his freedom. To say, let me just finish the thought because it's so slippery. Don't lose your thought. So the identification of the Creator and the creation is the ability of the Creator in his omnipotence to make a creature that has a freedom qua creature identically right. I mean, in other words, so the difference between the creator and the creature is not the personhood of the creature. They're both right. Or another way of putting it, the Godhead creates real persons. Who have qua persons, as again, this would be the Kantian thing, but it's there in Thomas. Qua persons, they are free. But that's where freedom resides in personhood.
Now look,
right?
there's something really hard here.
Okay.
The difference between the infinite and the finite, between the kinds of freedom that an omnipotent and eternal being that can't die in the important sense of cease to exist, that the freedom that such a being has, and the freedom that a finite being that has no recourse to any kind of internal absolute life, but is subject to mortality, fear, pain, torment, and the rest of it. And though there is a freedom in analogy, it's a little bit weird to say that to hold onto that analogy. It's like, it seems it has an element of sadism and perversity that's kind of infinite. To call that infinite, to call that analogies in any sense identical. What's the freedom? Where's the analogy? The analogy is between, it's like, I don't get it. If there's no actual continuity, if there's no actual spiritual continuity, precisely in a mystical sense, between the ground of the being of the creature and the ground of the being of the Creator, if that's absolutely severed, supposedly in the interests of the independence of the creature, then the analogy it comes to nothing. The analogy, one is infinite, and the consequences of his creation don't mean much to him. He's going to go on living forever anyway. Whereas
The ground is the freedom. That's the whole thing.
Well, I think that's true, but in terms of the way you pose the question about the difference between the finite and the infinite, one of the things the Thinking Now Occurring says, one of the outrageous things it says, is that the finite and the infinite are there's an identification of the finite and the infinite.
Well, but then if that isn't all the way to some kind of pantheism, transpantheism, panentheism, if it doesn't go that far, I don't see that it actually answers my question.
Well-
it seems like it's just playing with logic, because you can create logics in which the infinite and the finite are equatable. Yeah, I know how to do that.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure I'm doing the same thing you're doing
I
in
know
your
that.
logic, but okay.
Yeah.
But so you were saying, well, then it sounds like it reduces some sort of a mystical continuity or identity.
No. I'm saying if it doesn't,
Yes.
then
That's right.
then I don't.
And what
see
does
the,
it do?
I don't see the bite.
I understand.
Yeah.
And so what I would substitute for that,
Yeah.
however you would define it, that if it doesn't reduce to that, then you don't see the bite.
Well, I
you gotta
I wouldn't say reduced, because it doesn't seem to be reduced. It seems to me
That's
that
right. So
yeah.
what is it? What is the x in place of your y? Right? You're saying it's not y. It's not y,
You say
and
it's
if it
not
isn't y, I don't.
You say it's not Y.
Yeah.
Thinking
Well,
Frank says it's not Y.
I think you're agreeing with
Okay.
me.
Well,
I mean,
I'm
you're
saying
at
I
least
agree that you
provisional.
say that.
That's right. That's all I'm asking you to do.
Yeah.
It's history. It's the incarnation, right? In other words, the place where the infinite and the finite are, there is an identification of the infinite and the finite, is in the incarnation, and that is an historical moment, event, happening, change in being.
So what?
Right? Well, I thought you were looking for the.
No, I want to know where this analogy based on freedom has some kind of meaning.
Well,
Other
the
than-
incarnation,
other than words.
the freedom of.
That we have the choice to make gold or crap of this
Right.
independent world.
Right.
And therefore we are an analogy to the infinite creator who
Right.
can make anything, and for whose freedom doesn't redound upon him in terms of eternal torment if we screw it up. Where's the analogy?
Oh, you
In
mean
terms of freedom, where is the analogy between one kind of freedom and another?
Let me see if I heard right there. Our freedom
Our freedom
can
has
work to our good or to our ill,
Yeah.
but the divine freedom cannot work to the divine good or ill. Was that
Yeah,
pretty much
actually,
the point?
That's the point.
Okay. That's
Yeah.
what I thought. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I can see if there is
Right.
some kind
Yeah, I
of
see that.
substantial continuity
Right.
or asubstantial
Right.
continuity where the two are intertwined in some
Right.
essential
Well,
way.
then I come back.
Yeah.
I come back from another angle. I
Yeah.
come back to the notion of the incarnation, because in the incarnation you have the infinite God, whom you would otherwise think to be. You would otherwise think, and this is part of the
difference.
this is part of the
Yeah.
Althusserian dialectics.
Yeah,
He's-
yeah.
I mean, this is not something he's
Well,
not working with, right?
No, of course.
So, okay, so what otherwise would be an infinitely indifferent God
with a sadistic gift.
well, at least
Sadistic gift.
Okay.
Again, calling it freedom.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Or effectively sadistic,
Yeah.
right? Or as it might appear. But the incarnation puts an end to such a notion of God as this infinitely sadistic, indifferent God. And now just
Okay.
take Althuser's line of that.
Yeah.
In Althusser, then the putting an end to that God is absolute. Which is in other words, it's unqualified, and therefore the Godhead itself dies. You see, well, the thinking now occurring would be saying something more orthodox, if I can put it that way, right? At least in creedal terms, if not in conceptual terms, right? That the God who is indifferent, right, who has, if I can put it that way, nothing to lose, or the God who doesn't care, therefore the God who cannot suffer, you see, a loss, all right? That God, that notion of God, right? That
That's
notion,
gone.
that notion comes to an end in the incarnation, right? The thinking now occurring, as I said, I think last time, is not a new religion. Okay, so the question is, how can we understand conceptually the full intellectual implications of the incarnation at this point in history? But I think the minimal response to you, I want to try and answer you, but it's a little bit complicated. It seems to me the minimal response is to say that in the context of thinking now occurring, the divine freedom, which is the substantial analog of the creaturely freedom through the act of creation, right?
I'm sorry. I was trying to think and listen at the same time.
Yeah. That divine freedom is that divine freedom is just not a matter of indifference, because indifference is incompatible with the notion, certainly incompatible with the notion of the incarnation, and I think truly understood.
Yeah. Okay.
Despite all Kaiser, is truly incompatible with the notion of creation.
It's in the most focused sense. It's incompatible with the notion of the crucifixion.
Sure. Well, that's okay.
Well,
that's
so
right. Yeah.
That's the
Okay.
element of the
Right.
incarnation which it's incompatible with. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
But the thing, this is how, I mean, I'm sorry that
Okay.
I just go on with this, but it seems to me that taking the pathos of the Passion, or the pathos of Job, or any
Right.
of those pictures as a focus of meditation, I can hold my faith in that space. As soon as it becomes theological, it seems madness, in the sense that the actual attempt to because if I start asking questions about omniscience and try to align that with this great gift of the independence of creation, well, where's the omniscience? If God has to now he is suffering with mankind, where's the omniscience? It's gone. The omniscience is gone. Why would an omniscient God do that to himself and to us?
I don't know why it's incompatible with omniscience.
I'm sorry, omnipotence. Sorry, excuse me.
Oh,
Omnipotence.
okay. Why with an omnipotent God?
Yeah, I mean, this is classic.
Because an omnipotent God
question.
is able to. I'm going to pun a little bit here, but I think it's a significant pun. Is able to suffer. As in the thinking now occurring, we are now all clearly able to conceive ourselves to be called to do. An omnipotent God is able to suffer without ceasing in any way or diminishing his absolute divinity, to suffer the existence of another. Not another that is a function, a projection, an ideal limit to itself, but an actual other. And only an omnipotent God could create.
So in order for God to
And if you create-
experience
wait a
his
minute.
omnipotence, he's going to
No!
create a bunch of beings who are going to suffer infinitely, so he can enjoy his omnipotence to experience something other. What? I don't get.
No,
that.
I think it goes back to Jim's point. In other words, this God creates
Stephen already.
others that are endowed, qua creature,
Yeah.
with the freedom. And if it's real if it's real freedom, then there's no necessity. Not only is the fall in the thinking now occurring unconditionally unfortunate, but there's no necessity for it. Because if there's a necessity for it, then it's justified. And if it's justified, then I can flip the justification for evil, the necessity of it, I can flip it over and blame it on God. I'm saying if you've got freedom, there's no justification for evil. None whatsoever. And if there's no justification, freedom does not justify evil. Neither the divine freedom nor human freedom.
Something is a little twisted there.
But it permits it.
It permits it, yeah. Well, and it's consistent with the notion of freedom.
Well, you notice he's not using the concept of evil here. It's what he says is, unconditionally unfortunate, unhappy, and sorrowful. Those are the three things he says: unfortunate, unhappy, and sorrowful.
Yeah, those are
Right. So the actual development that's happening is that at the
page
at the
350.
very beginning of the chapter. Those first sentences.
But see, in
he
ordinary,
read, so he's not saying it's bad.
in ordinary historical human terms,
Well, I do use the word sin, right? I say,
Well, yeah.
yeah, that unhappy absolutely was the sin,
Right, yeah.
And completely sorrowful was the death, which would refer to the crucifixion,
Yeah.
the atonement
Yeah,
in that
sure.
in that sense.
But where is the?
So it's not denying that there is evil or that.
But now there's no sin. The sin is
But
gone.
there's a kind of a fundamental here. I mean, I didn't invent everything, right? So it's classic Christian theology, this thing called grace. Well, grace by definition means if you're saved by grace, Luther's salvation by grace or the Pope's, if you could buy it or whatever. However, if you can buy grace or just get grace, grace by definition is gratis. In other words, it's something you don't deserve. It's not due to you, right? It's something, therefore, that the Creator, right, gives.
But doesn't the actual phenomenology of grace, doesn't it seriously overcome this alterity, this distance, this otherness, this independence? When the sinful condition is cleansed by grace, where the suffering becomes bearable, where the suffering is no longer the unbearable suffering of the finite being struggling for its survival and its concern for its loved ones. When that becomes bearable in the same sense that you're saying the suffering of God becomes bearable, isn't there some kind of continuity that's reestablished between the human and the divine? Does it still remain utterly independent and other? No, doesn't it? I mean,
Well,
grace is sort of like
depends on which
over a
end we
gap.
start at. In the thinking now occurring, there's no question in the thinking now occurring
Yeah,
that all others, by definition, are
just
perfectly distinct. All others are perfectly distinct as such, and their, as it were, coexistence, the relationship is free, or it is one of freedom, however you want to phrase it, right? And perfectly so. Now, this does not necessitate it doesn't necessitate in the whole or in any one of the parts, it doesn't necessitate good or evil. Right? So I mean, we can make distinctions of graces here, but the grace of creation is the gift of freedom.
no, but the grace that redeems sin, the grace that's the jubilee that makes
Right.
the new condition one in which there's no sin.
Right.
That grace.
Okay.
Okay, now
That is in the context of thinking now occurring,
okay.
the incarnation or that grace of the redeeming act is the point in time in which the unity of the finite and the infinite actually occurs, right? Or maybe a better way of putting it, actually occurs I want to say concretely historically, even more so materially in flesh and blood. It actually occurs, or actually occurs, takes place in the world, so to speak, tangibly, unqualified. So it goes back to this question of the omnipotence question. In other words, a God who is able to actually become a creature without ceasing to be this infinite God. That's another version of this omnipotence by which the Father can generate a Son who is equally another person, a creator who can create a world which is equally free, right?
So that's the analogy that you were making before
Right.
between the persons of the Trinity and
Yeah,
and
and
the
I
creator
want
of the
to
world.
extend it here to the incarnation as
Yeah,
such.
okay, yeah.
Right. So a God who can assume the creaturely nature, in this case the human nature, right, without ceasing to be this unqualified and omnipotent God, because in fact the ability to do that is a kind of another example of exactly the kind of freedom from limitation that enables the God to create the world. Ultimate would be to, in some sense, become that world. Okay? Now I have to go back. Okay, well, there's a problem there, but I don't want to.
Look, can I get
Yeah.
away from, I think we're kind of immersed
Moving
in very interesting questions like salvation,
Right.
and so on. But you just said something that, again, I apologize, I wasn't here the
Okay.
last time, but it's something that took me back to page 316. You said that we're at a point in time. You remember saying this just now?
Well,
At a point in time
okay.
where this distinction between the created and the creator, while it doesn't collapse, it's transcended. Now I'm off what you said, but you used the phrase "point in time." Remember using that just now? And you define on page 316 a number of geometric relations: point, square, circle.
Right.
And I notice you've managed to square the circle here. Is that
Well,
what
that's,
what
I'm
you've done?
glad you can appreciate what's going on there. That's correct. That's
Is that what you did here when
Of
I
course,
was looking?
of course.
You squared the circle.
Of course.
Uh-huh.
And it's obviously evidently
Well, I mean,
that
if
I
you
have
can
done
square
so.
the circle, there shouldn't be any problem with.
I think there's no problem. Exactly. That's part of the point, that there is no problem. The squaring the circle is a problem that doesn't exist in an infinitely flat structured universe.
Yes. Okay. And
Or another way, let me do this because this comes
Go
up
ahead.
again in today's reading. In a universe in which the distinction between 2 and 3 dimensions is not a final distinction, where in some sense, as it says in the logical chapter, and it gets reiterated in different ways here, the 2 and the 3 in the 4, 1, 2, 3, at a certain point, they are materially interchanged. They become identical materially with one another. So yes, there is a squaring of the circle. There is a collapse of the finality or the simple self-evidence of the distinction between 2 and 3 dimensions. Okay, go on. I just want to bring that in as relevant.
yeah, no, that's I don't want to go on. You go. On. But
Well, I thought you had a point. Is that all you want to do about the squaring of the circle
well,
on this page?
I think if you squared the circle, there shouldn't be any problem with.
Well,
Squaring.
no, that's just the
squaring
beginnings.
God
No,
and his
you don't
creatures.
understand.
I think the squares God and his creatures.
Squaring the circle is just the beginning. Okay. In fact, the beginning,
You don't want to square God with his creatures.
the beginning transcends the distinction between being and nothing. Right. So, if you identify, which we have been doing here for some months, we identify existence as nothing but existence. All right. In such a way that what would be nothing has no status of its own, because that nothing is indistinguishable from existence. Okay. Analogously, when you say squaring the circle, I mean, we're speaking a little loosely here because there are different ways in which you can formulate that problem mathematically. And by the way, I wasn't the first to square the circle, you say, but the way in which it's being squared here is in a pre-mathematical way. It's being squared in terms of a logical geometry, as it's phrased here, right? And that's what's significant, right? In other words, that there is a foundational understanding in terms of which the distinction between the square and the circle, which is the one you have in mind when you raise that problem, is understood to be a further or dependent or subsequent level of analysis, which depends upon a more fundamental unity, at which point of unity, which is embodied in the logic, right, the distinction between the square and the circle does not exist. That's right.
Okay,
But-
since you invited it, just to, you start with the definition of point,
Right.
right? And as I say, you were just resorting to that. You said there comes a point in time,
Correct.
right? For whatever.
Right.
There comes a point in time for creation. Comes a point in time for the incarnation. Comes a
Right.
point in time for.
Well, excuse me, I just want to correct you technically. There does not come a point in time for creation,
Yeah,
but there does come a point in time for the incarnation.
I accept that. Yes, but there does come a point in time for the thinking now occurring.
It looks that way.
Soon.
So, but these things are disjunctive somehow. They're not a process. They're not an evolutionary thing. These are things that just happen. Is that right?
Well, I don't know whether they just happen, but
Yeah.
they're not. They do not happen. I want to keep saying, because Chuck keeps bringing this kind of Hegelian notion in. They don't happen as a matter of necessity. So, to the extent to which,
But they do happen as a matter of history.
yes. So history here is being
And history is
rethought.
not three events. Well, it is three events in some sense, I guess. But there are other events. You know, there's Descartes. That much we know.
Yeah.
Because the purpose of setting forth all these historical things is to say, see that's what it isn't.
No, that's yes,
there's a-
yes,
there's-
and no. It's not that simple.
No.
It's setting forth the historical things is to say this is what was,
Yeah.
and now we have something, as I like to say, completely different.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
You and
so
Monty
the-
Python.
That's right.
But I mean,
there's an essence of history which has nothing to do with the process of history, the unfolding of history, the dialectic of history, of all of these different models, for the way in which one subsequent event is in some sense determined by what is prior, whatever those models are. So the idea is that there is discontinuity in that sense,
Right.
and that's what you're calling freedom. And would you say that the analogy is exactly the analogy between the discontinuity between creator and creation is something that is repeated in that through so all the stuff
That's
that
not
we were talking
bad.
about
That's
before,
not bad because
that-
there was no
yeah.
necessity for the creator to create.
Yeah,
That's
okay.
right. Yeah. It was not a.
So-
it was not a further extension of. It was not. It was precisely not the Hegelian notion of any kind of self-realization
Yes.
on the part of the creator.
well, whether it was necessary or not, it was a good thing it happened. We would be having this conversation.
Well, I would say it remains to be seen.
I see.
Okay. Just to go back to 356 again, which is somewhat relevant to the point that you have just re-raised, where I was going there was that on this page, in effect, so let me come back to that bottom of the top paragraph there, where I speak of the after identity, right? That the subject is not extantness or other than extantness and so on, that the being of the subject is itself the extant abyss, the abyss extant in the face of creation, apart from which abysmal after identity, it itself is absolutely impossible. So there again, the thinking now occurring is this. The thinking now occurring is the absolute after identity. All right, and which is another way of saying, but saying, pointing to the past. Do you say? It's the after. It comes after all of this stuff. It is absolutely after it in the sense that it is discontinuous with it. It is not contained seminally, germinally in this past. Do you see? And therefore, it's the thinking now occurring is an absolute after identity, and it is so absolutely after, right? The subject in this case, that the subject now has no being apart from its being related to what now is occurring absolutely for the first time in history. If it wasn't, in other words, if the lights had gone out at whatever point the thinking now occurred, if that had been the end, do you see, then there would be no subject at all because the world would have gone down the chute. Right? That would have been the end of the whole kit and caboodle. Right? Everything would have gone out of existence. In place of everything having gone in place of the end of the world in traditional terms, what we now have is what? We have the new heaven and the new earth. If you put it in imagistic terms, right? We have a new world here.
We have a novitas mundi.
We have a novitas mundi, right? In a very specific sense, and the precise and specific sense is qua intellect, qua conception, qua understanding, however you want to slice that, right? But now, of course, I say in that specific sense, but part of the new understanding of understanding, part of the new conception of conception, do you see, is what? That there is no longer any difference between conception and actuality, right? So Kierkegaard's critique of Hegel depends upon the distinction between existential actuality and thought actuality, you see? Or it depends upon the difference between, put it in Kantian terms, the difference, Kierkegaard's critique of Hegel depends upon the distinction between possibility and actuality, you see? So in the thinking now occurring where there is nothing but existence, you see, you might say, I don't know whether this will work, right? There is possibility but actuality, right? Or there's no possibility that isn't actuality, you see? Now, and so, this is really where I wanted to go. So I put a note at the top of this page 356 to myself that the being of the subject is left behind. I've already said that a couple of different times, but I just want to zero in on that. And what interested me about that when I found myself formulating it, that kind of simplify the text a little bit, the being of the subject is left behind, I thought to myself, I remember saying something like that in Novitas Mundi. But so I looked it up, and on page 300 of Novitas Mundi, at the end of the epilogue, I say, which struck me, I liked it at the time, it struck me as a really nice way to put it. In Novitas Mundi, I say the future is left behind. Oh, that's kind of certain. The future is left behind, right? Okay. We're past the future, right? But here's the real point I'm making, I'm calling to your attention. It then occurs to me to see, I'm trying to get down to basics here, right? So in other words, it's really the same thing. It's the identical thing to say that in the thinking now occurring, the subject is left behind and the future is left behind because it's intrinsic to the subject to be, and the subject needs a future because the distance between the subject and the future, you say, is the analog of the distance in presence between the subject and the object. The object is present to the subject, or in phenomenological terms, which come up in the Heideggerian stuff here, the intentionality.
The subject is its possibilities, and the coming towards it of its possibilities is the Heideggerian model.
Yeah. Okay, all right. So the subject is nothing in the sense that it belongs to the past. The future belongs to the past. Okay,
it's no longer the subject that was constituted by its possibilities coming towards it out of the future. All of that's no there. So in that sense, there's no longer a future.
In that sense. Yeah. But to go back to the discussion that keeps coming up, that Alia guides us into, the unum, right, as the middle in the order 0 unum 1, right, the spirit in theological terms, that principle of unification in the logic, okay, is a absolute middle, we said, meaning that the end posts that remain out of reach in pragmatism, the beginning and the end, the ultimate, the past and the ultimate future, right, are identified in the unity of the fact that 1 equals 0 unum 1. They are identified, past and future, have their identity in the absolute now. In what sense? So in that sense, the future belongs to the past, right? But in the sense that what the future meant to the subjectivity of the past, a realization of some sort that was not yet arrived at, in that sense, qua realization, qua Persian, qua ultimate reality in the long run, it's no longer in the long run, it's here and now is the ultimate reality. Do you see? And the past as the if I put it in Persian terms, as a kind of sheer possibility, right? That point of the unrealized as such, right? The potentiality would be a Persian way, I think, of understanding it, right? The potentiality that hitherto was understood to be something prior to the moment, prior to the now, prior to the middle, is likewise incorporated in the moment, right? So the reality is in the absolute now, the realization and the potentiality are identically unified in the absolute now. That's what the logic is saying. So in that sense, subjectivity as the separation of these moments, and that's so profoundly, that's so profoundly Heideggerian, right? I mean, in other words, the whole notion of subjectivity as temporality, and temporality is this kind of distension, backwards and forwards, right? Anticipation and so forth. Yeah, so that's all gone. And in that sense, go back to Novitas Mundi in the first appendix, Alpha, the subsumption, as it were, of all distance by time, or another way of putting it more simply, is that in the thinking now occurring, there is no distance apart from time, or that isn't time. There is only time. In that sense, another way I put it in, I think it was in Novitas Mundi, yeah, again at the end of Alpha, I think, the displacement of space itself. Okay, and in that context, if we are at this more fundamental level, at the foundational level that is epitomized in the logical identity, if we're at the foundational. Waltraud asked last time at the beginning of the class. We never answered it, but I think you asked something about what did foundation mean. I think you did. Now, thanks to this conversation, well, the creation was foundational. Right? Now, if the Creator succeeded through an omnipotence substantially no different than the omnipotence exemplified in the Trinitarian reality of the Godhead, right? In creating an other, you see, which was not a function of some divine self, but was as other as the Creator was other, and had, in substantial analogy, its essence freedom, to say. I'm going to close that circle. Just lost the circle. Oh, foundation. Okay. So, at this point in history, it is now we can now directly conceive and think in the terms of this omnipotence, do you see, in which we, qua creatures, are now clearly participants, or of which we are now clearly participants, not participants as if we were included in the Godhead. Now the images are tough because it's hard to talk without spatial images, but logically included in the Godhead, but that we are as other than the Godhead. We participate in that same kind of creative dynamic, logical dynamic, which enables, or which is exemplified in the particular operations of this logic, or more generally.
But we're not free to think otherwise.
You're not free to think otherwise.
Is that right?
I think that's true.
So we haven't. So in coming full circle here, we've lost our freedom.
No, but you're free. No. You're free not to think. You're free not to think. Absolutely. And there are lots of people who take that option.
Well, I'm interested in something because I thought a lot about this, and I don't know if it patches on, or how it patches on, or how much it patches on. It's the notion that the radical distinction between possibility and factuality come together, so that nothing is a fact other than that it's a new possibility. The possibility is so intertwined with factuality that you don't have a split of here are the facts, here are the unrealized possibilities. The world goes through the creation of endless detritus of facts, and moves from the future or towards itself of these unrealized potentials which become potential. Rather, the very character of the concrete, historical, immediate reality has the tincture of possibility, that we live in possibility. I'm always thinking of that amazing Emily Dickinson line, I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose. You know, where the distinction doesn't make sense.
I don't remember it, but
it doesn't make
right.
sense. In other words, you would think, I bear in possibility a fairer house than fact, but instead of, she calls prose, prose.
Well, non-poetic, right?
But so the poetic is or the creative is the actual possibility, not possibility as dreamland, as opposed to factuality.
Right.
But factuality as possibility.
Okay.
So what is the case? So that there is some kind of change in consciousness, which the ordinary mundane consciousness of modernity or self-consciousness or whatever we want to do it is a world of endlessly hard fact. There is nothing but hard fact.
Right.
And that hard fact is only possibility in the sense of determinism or causality, or the passage from one fact to another, and factuality is possibility only for more facts, whereas things are really the opposite. Facts are facts only insofar as they are already and thoroughly possibility, and possibility covers everything. Not possibilities, which are just facts and the ghosts of facts or the premonitions of facts, but possibility as the entire ontological space, as it were.
Okay, it's tough to nail down, but I think
we're in similar
I think you're on the
territory.
right. I'm thinking again. My framework here is historically it would be Peirce, the firstness, secondness, and thirdness idea, right? And factuality, pure, unadulterated factuality, which, by the way, I hasten to say again and again, for Peirce is never found apart from its relationship to firstness and thirdness. Nevertheless, if I isolate it abstractly, pure factuality is a secondness, a finality, a brute, unreasonableness, just nothing you can do about it. It's devoid qua secondness of freedom and possibility. Okay.
Right.
Now,
so the spontaneity of the firstness has that quality of possibility.
Now, the other thing I think of when you say that, analogous to this, not unrelated, is Dewey, who was the third of the three classical pragmatists, and Dewey was the guy who. His form of pragmatism is sometimes called instrumentalism, and his notion of the pragmatic notion that thought ultimately relates to action, Peirce as the rule for action, James as the kind of particularist, what difference does the idea you have make here and now? That's where James is at, right? He's the particular man, he has something interestingly in common with the thinking now occurring, you see. But Dewey was the synthesis of the two of them, and Dewey wanted to concretize, as he should, coming in the third place. He wanted to concretize the notion of some kind of identification of thought and action, and the concrete form was the scientific experiment, you see, which he broadened out. He didn't mean just the scientific experiment in the lab, he meant that, but he meant the one that goes on in Washington, you see. So we tried the New Deal. From a Deweyan point of view, that was a perfectly good thing to do, qua experiment. You see? And what do you do with an experiment? You have an idea and you test it out, and then you see what actually happens. And every time you perform an experiment, you find out that, well, some of the things you expect to happen, but then there's some things that you didn't expect to happen, right? And then you have to adjust your idea. So for Dewey, the dynamic, you see, was the constant interaction, pragmatic in the most pedestrian sense of the word, political, social, scientific, constant interaction between thought and
action
experiment.
And response.
Action and response. Yeah. So when Dewey goes to define what science is all about, this is what I thought of when you were speaking. He defines science as changing things. It seems like a kind of simplistic idea at first sight, but what he's saying is science takes place not when we just sit here in the room and do nothing. Science takes place when I start, I get out my knife and I kind of start scratching in this to see what it's made out of. In other words, it's the very scientific procedure is instituting change in the environment. That's the process of discovery. And so what I'm thinking is that the thinking now occurring, to the extent to which it is this absolute eclipse of the limitations and the timidity, what I've called the timidity of pragmatism. Mm-hmm. The guy who wrote that review of Faith and Philosophy that I mentioned last time, I didn't mention this last time, but I mentioned that he zeroed in on the notion that this, according to him, is a philosophy of beginning, and he asked the question, he raised the question, wouldn't it be interesting, it would be interesting to see what a political philosophy, what the political implications of the philosophy of beginning might be. And in the context of saying that, he distinguished the thinking now occurring. He was pretty perceptive the more I think about it. He distinguished it from pragmatism because he said that pragmatism was essentially conservative. You see, which is really interesting because pragmatism, especially as practiced by Dewey, is into changing the world. He asked Dewey what science is all about. It comes up later in the book. I'm jumping ahead. Science is all about creating new individuals. And it's very Aristotelian, except Aristotle was not creating new individuals. But Aristotle understood that the object of scientific knowledge was, and that's in chapter 1 of Novitas Mundi, in a very abstract way, for the real object of science, or actual knowing, for Aristotle, as emphasized in Novitas Mundi, is an individual existent, not an abstract idea. Does anybody remember that? All right. Dewey understands that, but he's got the American, pragmatic, post-Peircean version of that, and it's not just that science is about concrete individuals. It is for Dewey, but it's producing them, creating them. Okay, so take that notion that pragmatism is very into change, do you see? And implicitly, if not explicitly, the responsibility for changing the world, right? And take it to the unqualified extent of the thinking now occurring. So when you're saying that there's no fact which is not
possibility,
you see, there's no fact that's supposed to just sit there, right? In other words, the world is here to be transformed, and our job is to transform it, to create it, or recreate it, or however. I don't like recreate. I'm being loose, right?
And there are no a priori conditions on how that can proceed.
No, which is scary.
Yeah,
that's right. That's scary. Freedom is, and my good friend Sartre makes this point psychologically, right, and ontologically, that freedom leads to anxiety, right? Anguish in Sartrean terms, right? Vertigo, at least a dizziness, right? So I spend most of my life trying to deny my responsibility for the environment, because if I took it very seriously, I'd start, I'd probably fall down, right? It's right. I would be overcome with a certain whatever, all right?
Wouldn't know what to do anymore.
Well, whatever, right. Now, the solution to that particular objection, and the thinking now occurring, is what to do is right there. In other words, because of the absolute particularity of personality, it's not like, and I think this departs from Sartre, who, because he's an idealist, makes me responsible in some cosmic sense for what's going on in Iraq, and in his day would have been, Algeria or whatever. And there's a certain truth in that, but it's an idealistic truth. The much more concretely real truth is that I'm not responsible so much for what's going on in Iraq as I am I'm responsible for what's going on in Canadensis in Pennsylvania, or even more, or what's going on in my house, or whatever, you see. So it's the same idea, but you couldn't overly concretize the situation for which we are responsible in the context of the thinking now occurring.
I was struck by what you just did with trying to illustrate what science was, which was to get out the knife and
poke around.
Yeah. Now, the idea of science under the new thinking,
right,
in the new thinking, is that intellectually we don't need a knife. Is that right? That the word triumphant, in a sense, pervasive, fully the world, that it permits understanding all the possibilities without instrumentality. Is that right?
Well, without the distinction between the word and the knife. So, in other words, we may need a knife, but the knife that we now have available to us in principle is a knife that is thoroughly intelligible. The knife, what would be an instrument over against a principle, PAL, right? Is now an instrument which is in principle at one with, permeated, principle PLE, in principle permeated by the principle PAL, right? In other words, the agent and the instrument are, that distinction, as it were, is collapsed. Another way of putting it is that in principle, what we have now at our disposal in principle is, and we have to work it out, we actually have to do it, right? But in principle is now intelligible, that the world is intelligible through and through, and therefore this is intelligible through and through, in principle. Something like that.
How I don't know. Let's go on.
All
I
right.
got billions of questions.
Yeah, there are going to be a lot of questions.
Yeah.
I just want to pick out some of the things that struck me as important in the context to emphasize. And page 3, I actually jumped ahead to get to this subject business. Going back to 354 and 55, and going down to the bottom of page 354. In fact, since this would be in the spirit that we've been talking about, if we take maybe the bottom third of the paragraph of the text on 354, where it says "we Daseins," not Dasein, we ourselves, which is a distinction I'm making from Heidegger, right? But we ourselves, not ourselves, we the news, which I kind of like, that's kind of perverse. We are the news, right? But in a kind of a noun sense as well as just right? In the distributive sense, we are the news. We the news. We the nows dwell in the absolute objectivity, in the absolutely outwardized Dasein of the one existent spirit. We are the actual unity of the spirit hovering over the abyss in the form of the new beginning. All right. So hovering over the abyss is a biblical image, but if I were to translate it right away quickly back into the thinking now occurring language, it's hovering over the abyss is like being after the abyss, right? Or being in the position to empower the past. Do you see? To being in the position of the realization of what the past as essentially anticipatory could never realize. See? And Heidegger is the profoundest appreciator of anticipation, right? So it's not an accident
of the potentialities that still remain in the past
right.
that weren't capable of being realized at the time.
Okay.
Could you say what is meant by outwardized Dasein? You use that word a lot.
Yeah, it first came up in the what I call that in section 2.4, which is the section that focuses on Altaiser the first time around, rather exhaustively. And Altaiser has the notion of a kind of emptying out of our interiority of the traditional self-consciousness. He's got this notion, right? But the emptying out for him, what goes out. Well, it's an ongoing. To use the language of Chuck introduced, for Altaiser, this emptying out is an ongoing process. There's no end to it, which corresponds to the fact that speaking ontologically or cosmologically, he speaks of an absolute future. Mm-hmm. Well, what is true of an absolute future has its corollary in the interior, the experience of a continuous evacuation of our traditional subjective interiority. But the point over against the thinking now occurring is that it's not done with. I mean, if I'm in Altaiser's shoes, that's where I am. I've got my absolute future, and I'm devoid of my subjectivity, but not completely. Okay, so the thing now occurring is the absolute evacuation, the subject remaining in the past. And if I associate, I keep reading Kierkegaard, I just can't get away. It's like a form of addiction. And Kierkegaard, when he talks about Luther, he says Luther introduces great principle of inwardness, right? Which in philosophical terms we would call subjectivity. The religious principle of inwardness for Luther was, hey, you don't get to heaven by doing all these external acts, staying up in the middle of the night, lighting 28 candles and, flagellating yourself. It's inwardness. That's Luther's principle, see, spiritually. Okay. But that coincides, by the way, to the Cartesian inwardness, the scientific inwardness. This is not an accident, historically. Okay. So, in Altize's case, there's an appreciation, I would say really a sense, as he himself says, he can neither conceive nor define the new humanity. He says that literally in total presence. Can neither be conceived nor defined, but certainly he senses it. And what he senses is this loss of the subject. But he's at a loss, because all he's getting is the loss of the subject. He's not in the after identity of the thinking now occurring. Okay, so when I refer to an absolute exteriority, it is in the context of being done with the inwardness, of being done with all interiority, subjectivity, and so absolute exteriority functions as a counter as objectivity, pure objectivity would be now that pure objectivity, as I said in a different context, is associated even here with particularity. With it's the plurality of news, the plurality of nows, the plurality of persons that constitute this objectivity. So we're not. There's no possibility of a totalitarian claim here, as I've said many other times, but I just want to reiterate it since we're on this page. Okay, so qua beginning with the new creation, the face of an absolute creation existing here and now, and in effect this is a good summary of what I was trying to say about how we are substantively in the position of the freedom, the creative freedom of the Creator, which is due to having been created, but due to having been created by a Creator who has the power to make something simply other, right? We offer the first time, this one absolutely, the absolute inversion of the abyss ex abysso, the beginning. This now occurring unity is the absolute template of the new creation, the beginning of the new world, the beginning of the new humanity. Right? That's that same new humanity that Altizer senses but cannot define and cannot conceive of in the strict sense of the word. Nor might this one now actually existing for the first time as the essence of history be either more or less than the absolute template. I've already said absolute template, but it can't be more or less than that, than the absolute actuality of the act of creation. And the reason I wanted to zone in on this, or hone in on it, you zone out, right? You hone in. My grandchildren came up one day and said, "Do you ever zone out?" By which they meant, do you ever sit and look at the trees? So, honing in on absolute template, notice this is equated in the text with absolute actuality. I'm reminded to point that out because there's no more or less than the template, as if there was a template to be actualized. You see? So it goes back to that something we discovered when we were doing Novitas Mundi about the schema, that in effect it's not simply that the schema is removed, but it's completely transformed. There is no distinction between the schema and the actuality, between the template and the actuality. They're two different. Now, what's the point of that in the context of which that has developed here, in the context of the notion that we are now participating in a freedom, clearly, consciously, qua consciousness, I guess that's what I want to say. Right? Qua consciousness, we are now participating. We may all along, by the way, for all I know, in some sense. But for the first time, in a way that is unprecedented qua consciousness, we are participating in that creative freedom. Right? So what's the point saying that there's no difference between actuality and template, between schema and existence. Well, the difference is that, or as I said in the chapter on Derrida, section 2.3, existence itself is the text, or the text is existence itself. These are existence itself is the text, existence itself is the template, existence itself is the schema, is just another way of trying to get at this notion that what otherwise might appear to be, at first glance, sheer, brute, Persian factuality is possibility. It's not just possibility in a future sense, as if there was a future outside of this existence, but there's no past outside. So in other words, the possibility that this factuality is the possibility not only for change, but also the possibility which means that it didn't have to be this way, that whatever the fact is, there is a responsibility for it, right? So I would say the responsibility might be an analog here of past directedness, to say, and then the future would be directedness forward. And what I'm trying to say is that in the absolute now, that existence is, right? What Chuck calls facts.
Well, there would be no thrownness in the Heideggerian sense.
Yeah. But on the other hand, but if existence is a text, well, people write texts. Texts. You see what I mean? Texts are works of intelligence, and a text, good or bad, is a creation, and a template is something that somebody draws up or draws down from the sky, depending if you're a Roman making templates, right? Make a temple, right? In other words, a template, a schema, a text is a creative act of intelligence. And so put it all together, the thinking now occurring is saying that existence, right, which otherwise might pass for a factuality in the process of becoming perfectly intelligible, or coming from someplace when it was less intelligible, it's saying that existence here and now is perfectly intelligible. It is perfectly the manifestation of and the responsibility of a creative intelligence.
I mean, in a certain sense, you were saying is it ain't going to get any more intelligible.
Yes.
So the fact that what would previously have been, it's kind of intelligible, but we could do better, or we better work at it to make more sense of it, and most of it is chaotic, inchoate, unintelligible. Actually, that amount of intelligibility that is at hand, that's it.
Yes, but now I have the freedom. I have the freedom not to pay attention. I have the freedom not to think. You see, I have the freedom not to take advantage. I don't like the word either. Okay, I'm going to use it again anyway. Of the unprecedented historical opportunity, right? Or better than opportunity. I have the freedom not to take advantage of the novitas mundi that is now clearly conceivable, or clearly able to be conceived to be the case, right? Can I stay in bed? Yeah, I can stay in bed. No one's going to force me out of bed, get me to work. So I have a freedom, but I don't have a freedom, right, to think in the past, or I don't have a freedom to think now, right? Because if I think that, well, I need to know more, I need to have a greater thing, right? There's something missing in terms of my capability, then I'm living in the past.
Okay, listen to this.
Okay.
I feel there's this enormous sense of that is part of our current mind.
That's good.
Yeah. I also feel that the entire of public outwardized life is increasingly dominated by models of determinacy, control, exactly the extreme opposite. And I don't, this is where we're back. I don't know how to square that without putting it in absolute devil and angel and theological terms. I don't know how to square that, because it's clear that you don't have Dewey'ites determining American policy today in terms of Iraq was not an experiment. It was a belief in an absolute project, to the extent that no new information gets to come in. The project continues no matter what they find out.
I know
So-
where you're coming from, but I think we
there's a
also
hell
have
of
to
a lot
be fair.
more-
There has
there's a-
been some adjustment on the part of the administration to unwelcome reality. Slow.
Well, okay, that's just to show
Right.
that
So-
Dewey's right in spite of them, but then wouldn't admit it. But apart from that, there's an enormous historical tendency in that direction. It seems like the calculable in a Heideggerian sense moves on apace. It increases. The desert increases in the Nietzschean sense more and more. The domination of material reality by an ontology that seeks to treat it as only that which is capable of control worms its way into every area of public life through every kind of bureaucracy. You know this very, very well. So how does that work? How does that work with this? Is that this doesn't seem to be just the consequence of freedom and unthink.
Might be.
But it seems to be an enormous amount of what looks like intelligence going into doing this. The intelligence, we can easily.
I don't want to get into a political discussion, although we could have that, but I don't think. But however, to the extent to which I take your point,
my point isn't related to this because this is.
So you're being critical of the current regime, right?
No,
Okay.
that's not my point.
No,
My
as an
point-
example.
my
You're
point
using it as an
is
example. As an example.
of what's happening now.
But the critique is already built into the situation because the people who are critical of the current regime will say that it's mindless. And in effect, you're saying...
No, that's not, but that's still not. It isn't even that strong an example. That's just a very small example of the expanse of calculation, control, technology, and in terms of the faith in the new possibility as a point
I'm glad
in
you
time.
said that.
Yeah.
I'm glad you said that.
Yeah.
You need faith as one of the main points. We haven't emphasized it enough, I guess, right?
Wow.
The other thing about the thinking now occurring is that it coincides with faith. It's not that you have to have faith to believe in the thinking, right? You cannot think
Okay.
in a way that is not... The essence of the thinking is faithfulness. So in a sense, maybe the answer to your question, which I don't want to be too glib or too easy, too quick about it, but there might be some truth in the thinking now occurring to the notion, the Kierkegaardian notion, because remember, I do like Kierkegaard, despite the fact that he was a subjective guy in spades, but he had one good observation, which I think applies whether you're subjective or not, because I think it's the common element between Kierkegaard and the thinking now occurring is the faithfulness idea. Right? What I like about Kierkegaard intellectually is that he expresses something of the essence of faith in the 19th century in a way which, because of his intellectual poverty, I don't mean his lack of brains, I mean because there was no thinking now occurring. He had nothing to work with. There was no apparatus. There was no framework for him to positively articulate what faith was all about. Right? Thinking now occurring is understood to be the positive intellectual articulation, not hitherto possible, therefore through no fault of Kierkegaard's, not hitherto articulated, could not have been, but in articulating it, it articulates faith. In other words, in the language of the preface here, reason, logic, right, as the kind of epitome of reason, explodes to fit the form of faith. And so that you could read the analogy, the subsequently discovered analogy between the Trinity and the logic, as just a little evidence of that notion, or an example of it, right? The logic has, as it's turned out, has literally, in some sense, exploded to fit the form of faith. So, go back to Kierkegaard. So, what Kierkegaard would say, although he would not be talking about thinking, Kierkegaard would say, I am absolutely alone. This would be Kierkegaardian subjective way of putting it. I'm absolutely alone with God if I have faith, and it's just to use a Heideggerian term retroactively, it would be absolutely inauthentic for a Kierkegaardian individual to be worried about, spiritually speaking, other people. Do you say? I'm saying the analog. Now watch what I'm doing. Remember I said the problem with Kierkegaard is that he's subjective, but what that translates into is that he can't imagine, he imagines this radical separation, what is between what is true in faith and what is naturally the case. Okay. So if, in some sense, the dichotomy between nature and spirit, body and soul, however you want to slice it, is transcended in the thinking now occurring, then in a certain sense, now it has to be qualified because it's a little more complicated than Kierkegaard had the luxury of being in a perfectly abstract context when he spoke of this that subjectivity is truth, right? But analogously, in the thinking now occurring, it's really somewhat beside the point to be focused on how terrible things are in general or down the block or whatever. In other words, the creation of the world is something that is not going to happen abstractly, it's going to happen concretely. And therefore the reflection, the negative reflection on the...
This goes back to the opening of the entire foundation. The reference to 1989 and so forth.
Right.
Where you invite that. You invite a reflection on something that is exactly outward, that's not simply a matter of one's own subjectivity and one's own faith and one's own... Yeah, so...
But I think I did just say negative reflection. Don't rule out positive reflection.
No, but I'm saying you can't just say it isn't our business to worry about that.
I'm not saying it isn't your business to worry about it, but I thought the original point was, what is all of the negativity, or all of the bad? What does it all say about the thinking now occurring? I thought that was the thrust of your objection.
Well, the thrust of it was a positive statement about something that's happening in history.
Right.
Is the thinking now occurring?
Okay.
And that's reflected in international politics, globalization, and the rest of it. But what seems to be reflected in international politics, globalization, and the rest of it is the opposite of the thinking now occurring.
I understand that, but my objection to your objection is that your objection seems to me to abstract from the concreteness of globalization. In other words, whatever the good and bad aspects of globalization are, I think there are both. And I think what's going on is actually happening in a multiplicity of concrete circumstances. And it's right. And I personally, I don't have the expertise or even the time to pass judgment on, right, because I have to do my thing here. I don't mean my thing in a narrow sense. Right? In other words, I have to deal with the thinking now occurring here and now as it's occurring in this context. How it's occurring in India.
No, but
it's an interesting question, but it's not one that I can directly address. If you're asking me,
I'll drop it. We'll go ahead.
I think it is occurring, but I'm not in a position to demonstrate that. Okay. Let's take a look at Maimonides before the clock runs out on us here. This gets us into the beginning of the mathematics and the language. This dovetails this question also. Oh, and by the way, I call to your attention footnote 13 on page 357 for a rather thorough technical explanation of how the.
Quickly.
Yeah.
What is the E4 again? How does that work?
Where are we looking now?
Just in these numbers in when you get it 2.304 E4. I just keep forgetting
okay.
What that
is. E is a. I don't know what the technical term. Depending on your calculator, it's E4 is the mechanical equivalent, I guess you would say, of times 10 to the fourth power.
Okay.
Right? It's an exponential.
Yeah, okay, all right. That's all I want to know. Yeah.
Oh, the exponential 4, yeah.
Yeah. So, but it's 2.304 times 10 to the 4th?
That's right. So, right.
Okay.
That would be the scientific notation.
Okay.
And the E, I use the E because it's quick and easy to, when I was typing it. But you could substitute times 10 to the whatever follows the E.
I hate to do this, but could you go back just quickly to page 314?
Well,
because it's mathematical, okay?
Okay.
All right, and you, the next to the last line
on 314.
314 is that where it says AC, is that a misprint?
All three of its linear parts, AC, AC, and AD. Well, what am I talking about here? Regular geometric proportion. Okay, now the regular geometric... Yeah, no, that's up... Oh, I see what it is. Yeah. No, it's not in a misprint, because if you look up on the proportions on the top part of the page, it's referring to the middle one, right?
The two means are the same.
So you have two
Right.
separate notions designated by the same AC and AC are somehow distinct.
Yes, because in the case of the geometric proportion, if the whole line is AB,
Yeah.
and I divide it in the middle, I divide it C, and then if I divide between C and D, correct? I divided, pardon me, between C and B, the end of the line, I get D. Right? So I got AB line, C in the middle, and then D in the middle between C and B. I have the choice when I set up the proportion to say that AB, the whole line, is to AC, half the line, as AC is to DB, or I could have said as CB is to DB, because AC equals DB.
Yeah.
Are you with me?
They're not parts.
They're not parts?
They're not parts, no. Well, I don't... That's weird. Sorry, go back to my...
They're parts of the line. Okay.
AC... Well,
Okay.
AC is a part of the line, I agree. But AC is not a separate part of the line. AC is AC as a part of the line.
Right. Okay.
All right. Go
Okay.
ahead.
This may come up again in another context.
Go ahead.
Now where was I? Oh, I was. We were looking at
356.
356. I was just calling. I don't want to go through that footnote, but it explains if you have any doubts about how the computations are made. The basic three computations that are made in this methodology are the integral product, which I demonstrated last time, the square of the odd numbered digits counting left to right of any given natural number, the rational product, which is taking that same series of individual numbers and setting it up as a proportion of whatever length. So the first number is to the second, is the third, is to the fourth, and so forth. And then the product of that multiplication of ratios gives you the rational product. And then the third, sometimes used, not often used, but sometimes used, the linear product, which is a straightforward multiplication of all the numbers, right, one into the other. It gives you the linear product of a natural number or of a word read mathematically. All right. And then in the text, well, I guess that's triggered by my... that's triggered by something else. Okay. Oh, well, maybe I should also say, since I'm on that, what I point out at the beginning of that footnote 13 is that, which I said to you in class last time, is that the way in which I treat the Hebrew and the Greek, that is reading them as this series of ratios, and that methodology was first developed back before it ever dawned on me to look at the other languages, when I was simply looking at what the, let's say, the 4, 1, 2, 3 as the minimum logical order, what I call the minimum order, with the 4 coming first, then 1, 2, 3. And then at that time, I would compute the 4 times 3, the odd number digits. So in other words, the integral product of the minimum order would be, did I do that right? No, 2, 4 times 8, 64. You see? So anyway, without going into that at that time, that methodology I just carried over when I started to look at the language in the same context as a series of ratios or as a set of one or more proportions. Right. So that the top of that footnote just tries to make that clear. Now. There are a couple of complex things going on here, both of which I want to deal with, and one of which probably only I'll have time to do here. So let's take the the Maimonides one. Maimonides, in the Guide for the Perplexed, we can kind of drop into his text. So kind of
before you
yeah.
do, could I ask a question
Sure.
about the double,
Yeah.
with a capital D?
Yeah.
What does that refer to?
Okay. Again, it's a
359.
yeah. I know what you're. Yeah, the
chapter.
self-identity of the double. Its most specific references to Althuiser's thinking again, the death of God theology, in which he understands the process, if you want, of identity to be some form or another of a self-doubling. Okay, and so to put it in the larger context of some of the issues that have come up here hitherto and are really coming up here again in a more complicated way, maybe. This notion that I'm, talk about squaring the circle, put it numerically, I'm saying that 1 equals 2 in the thinking now occurring. And I'm saying, more particularly in today's assignment, that 2 equals 3, you see? So that if I put it in terms of the Trinity, Father and Son equal Father, Son, and Spirit. In other words, you can't have the 2 without having the third equal. That's what's being said logically. And to reduce 2 equals 3 to its, to the starting place, since we don't start with 0 in the mathematical sense, 1 equals 2. So here's the point. If 1 equals 2, that 2 is to be distinguished from a 2 that is understood to be a self-doubling, to being the same one, just doubled or repeated. That is to say, in the logic, the 2 that 1 equals is not a self-doubling or a double. It is 2 actually distinct others, again, to use the other level of language here, right? That's the point. And so what's going to be done there technically, which we're not going to be able to do now because I want to focus on something else, that we come back, that introduces the discussion of Maimonides, but then after the discussion of Maimonides, in today's assignment, we look at the relationship between the notion of the atonement as it is understood in the thinking now occurring linguistically and mathematically, and its relationship to the linguistic and mathematical double, all right, in the Hebrew. And it's a way of, I'll just summarize it without going through we'll go through the technicalities next time, perhaps as an opener. What the math analysis there does, it just shows that when I set up the Hebrew for atonement and double, they have a lot of common letters, a lot of common numbers, a lot of common elements. There's only one really the change of one letter or one number, therefore, would distinguish them. Then I do a rather elaborate, complicated, but really simple mathematical analysis of how they're related to one another, how the various elements of these proportions are related to one another. The bottom line is to point out, and this goes back to something we were saying before, that in the linguistic mathematical analysis, the double notion, you see, is not erased, right? In other words, unlike a Hegelian, see, if Hegel had this problem, by the way, he doesn't have this specific problem, but let's say Hegel's problem was self-doubling. Well, Hegel will say, yeah, it's self-doubling, but self-doubling is just the form of the atonement, right? And self-doubling is sublated, and that means to Hegel that the atonement has come to be realized as only ideally and temporarily, momentarily in the form of the self-doubling. The subtle, but the difference that makes all the difference in the thinking now occurring, is that the atonement is not, the self-doubling is not an ingredient in a dialectical process of sublation, so that it appears to be retrospectively nothing but an alien form of what in this case is the atonement, since I'm using it, but that it is something that actually belongs to the past. Just as I said, the subject is impossible apart from the absolute after identity. In other words, it has a being as past being in the context of an absolute after identity. Otherwise, the world would be over. It's an extreme way of putting it. Analogously, all the math and all the Hebrew analysis here is to show linguistically here, mathematically in the reading, that the double is included in the atonement as that which is relegated to the past, to put it on the analogy to the subject, right? So self-doubling is a form, an Altizerian, post-Hegelian form of subjectivity. It's a specific late form of the notion of identity in Altizer. And what is being said therefore effectively is that in a sense, you see, in other words, in a sense, it is preserved. Hegel's Aufhebung is the preservation of something through destruction. You see? This make it simple, so simple. Hegel would preserve the hamburger by eating it. That's the way he preserves his hamburger. The truth of the hamburger is being consumed. Okay? The truth of the hamburger and the thinking now occurring is being left behind. It's not being eaten. It's yesterday's bread. Let somebody else buy it. Okay? I want fresh bread. I'm sorry. Okay? I'm fussy. Okay? So in other words, there's no. Right? It's a very big. It's a critical difference. It has to do with the notion of discontinuity. See? It has the notion of the thoroughgoing absolute novelty of existence. Right? Not a rehashing, right? Not a transformation of the past, but an appreciation of the past as past.
You now got me back to what the bite of all that stuff that I was yelling about was about, which is that it's not to make a point about all the evil politics, but that the basis of that politics is quite the opposite. It's based on the idea that A causes B. We drop a bomb, it destroys the city.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, that I accept that as a critique.
Okay, that was the point of it.
Okay.
Just to make the point, globalization is a fantastic thing for the undeveloped world. And just read Nicholas Kristof's works recently on why it's better to go work in a sweatshop than to be on the street in Cambodia.
I am not here either to defend
I just want
or
to make
attack.
that point since
Okay.
other points have been made.
Okay, fair enough. Okay.
I
Now, where was I? For Maimonides. Okay. So, however, since this section begins with the double atonement, I think it was worth doing that. Now, Maimonides is a more narrow topic, but or deeper topic, and what he's doing in this passage on 363 is that he is doing an exposition, or whatever you might want to call it, on the expression, the way in which God identifies himself to Moses as I am who am, or I am that am, as I think it's translated in this text, and dropping in about 10 lines. Then God, that is in the quotation from Maimonides, then God taught Moses how to teach them and how to establish amongst them the belief in the existence of himself, namely by saying, oh, by the way, I thought of Jim here, right? How does God establish his existence? By saying so. Does the saying make it so? Well, if the saying, you see, is the divine saying, it does make it so. The world was created in and through the Word, and apart from the Word, nothing came to be. So Maimonides, by saying Eye, Asha, Eye, a name derived from the verb haya in the sense of existing. For the verb haya denotes to be, and in Hebrew no difference is made between the verbs to be and to exist. The principal point, says Maimonides, in this phrase is that the same word which denotes existence is repeated as an attribute. Right? So this is Maimonides' version, although it's not exactly the same, but he's looking at this in the way in which Augustine might look at it, right? The difference between subject and predicate. He's not as radical, right? He's not Trinitarian, but he sees, in other words, that the attribute is identical with that to which it is attributed. All right. Dropping down toward the end of that paragraph, about 5 lines up from the end, or 6 or 7 lines up. This is therefore the expression of the idea that God exists, but not in the ordinary sense of the term, or in other words, he is the existing being, which is the existing being, is the way in which he's translating it. That is to say, the being whose existence is absolute. Right? The proof which he was to give consisted in demonstrating that there is a being of absolute existence that has never been and never will be without existence. All right. I'm going to stop there because we have just 1 minute left, and it's going to be a little too I don't want to start for a minute, so I'll pick it up here, and I want to tie it in with the distinction he makes between God and the name that existed with God before the creation. That all comes together on page 364. So we'll try and do that for openers, but we're going to go on, of course, to the next reading. So we'll stop there for now. If you have questions, which I'm sure you might, please. By the way, you may have visited the forum already, but I don't think anybody's yet signed in. You know, that sign-in button the first time around. So that way, if you sign in, I know you've been there at least once, and I don't have to worry.
I've been there today.
Okay. All right.
I'm seeing nothing.
Okay. And what I was about to say was, as usual, please use the